Okay, now we're trying to continue with the broadcast. We're having really most frustrating technical difficulties today. I was just getting into the Lavrov address to the Symposium for Creating the Future, having played the song The Wondrous Future. And the key line, obviously, in that was the fact that the singers, indeed, said that they had heard the voice from the wondrous future and they were beginning their journey to it now. So it would seem to be, given that that was made 60 years ago, a quite incredible coincidence if any such things were ever to occur. So I'm now going to return to the Lavrov document that will no doubt have glitched out because it hates being open for more than a few seconds. Yeah, lo and behold, it doesn't want to open this. So I'm going to have to reopen the document and retranslate it. So please just bear with me for a moment, please, while the hamsters spin in the Russian broadband wheel. Let's see if it will translate at the second attempt, which it has. Good news. So I'm now going to read through the introduction for the second time, and I thank you for your patience. Rest assured, this is enormously exasperating for me, and Sam assures me that he can patch it all together, though it's then very difficult to broadcast because it'll end up being over 2 hours long. So Mr. Sergei Lavrov says in his greetings to the Symposium to Create the Future, "Dear friends and colleagues, it's nice to be on this new project aimed at bringing people together as much as possible, looking for common denominators and developing recommendations that will help all mankind to live as the ancestors of each people and nationality bequeathed." That ties in there with the Professor Dugin and Russian concept of civilizational states, there only being a certain number of them in the world. He continues, "In this sense, the platform of the National Center of Russia, created on the initiative of President Putin, should contribute to the consolidation of the socio-economic, scientific, technological, and cultural potential of Russia, with a view to accelerating its further progressive development and promoting our experience, traditions, ideals in dialogue with the world community, which I hope will be launched today. We are going here on November the 4th, a day of national unity, indeed a state holiday, dedicated to the feat of the People's Militia Forces exactly 412 years ago, under the leadership of Mr. Minin and Mr. Pozharsky. They liberated Moscow from Polish interventionists and their accomplices. This bright page of history is an example of what achievements a people who have become united for a common goal are capable of. The theme of one of the sessions of our symposium today, which has been announced, is the future of the multipolar world. It fully reflects the essence of the discussions that have unfolded in the scientific, expert, and political circles in Russia and abroad. Today, it is difficult to imagine that in the early 1990s, it seemed to many that the end of history had come and unipolarity reigned forever. Global Pax Americana, when everything in any part of the world should be under the sight of Washington. And indeed, that was the subject of that famous article written by Francis Fukuyama entitled the end of history, which many years later he acknowledged was wrong. It was at that time, said Mr. Lavrov, that the outstanding statesman, Mr. Primakov, formulated and began to promote the innovative concept of multipolarity. Few foreign partners, and indeed, to be honest, even those in our country, were ready to subscribe to it and take it seriously. However, Mr. Primakov's ideas were shared by our Chinese friends. In 1997, the Joint Declaration on a Multipolar World and the Formation of a New International Order was signed. And it's this document where now the hyperlink for the first time actually works correctly. And it takes us to a 3-page document. And incredibly, that document, even in the time, in 1997, when it was circulated, the only description of it was Diplomatic Bulletin number 5. And here we are, 27 years on, and you will see how incredibly prescient and significant this document is. And it's my real pleasure to bring this to our audience, and I'm going to read it through in full, okay? Lavrov goes on to say, it was the first ever foreign policy document on this topic. Today we see that the forecasts of Mr. Primakov and his like-minded colleagues turned out correct. So I'm going to leave this Lavrov speech now and go to the 1997 document. Then I'm going to play some music. Playing the music seems to be the problem with the broadcast. We may cut out again. If we do, then I'm just going to have to log out, log back in, and then we'll come back to read the rest of the Lavrov statement. So please bear with us, and we'll try and patch the whole thing together. So now, going to the Russian document, which I've reproduced in full on X, and you'll be able to read along with me in this one, if you like, by going to the headline announcement for the show, and then if you read in the comments, it's the third part of the Russian-Chinese joint declaration on a multipolar world and the formation of a new international order. Now, to be clear, this is the vision that Mr. Primakov and his Chinese counterparts had in 1997, only 6 years after President Bush the Elder had said that we were in a new world order because the bipolar world had ended and it had gone to a unipolar world with American hegemony. Okay. So the text then continues in this document, and I've provided the actual original link there. Seriously, this is very, very significant. So if you're with us again, please do listen carefully to this, and you can either read along or go back and read it afterwards when you see the link that I provided. The Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, hereinafter referred to as the parties, proceeding from the development of relations of equal and trust-based partnership aimed at strategic cooperation in the 21st century. So when they wrote this, they were in the 20th century. This was already looking forward into the next century. From the responsibility to the world community that they bear as permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as from the coinciding approaches to major international problems, declare the following. And there's 7 points here. Number 1, the parties, in the spirit of partnership, will make efforts to promote the development of a multipolar world and the establishment of a new international order. So bear in mind, this was agreed before President Putin became the president. At this point, I think he was like the mayor of Leningrad. And years or so before President Xi became the president of China. Okay? This just goes to show that they've inherited this in part. They've greatly expanded upon it with the Belt and Road Initiative and the Greater Eurasian Partnership. But this was started a long time ago. The parties believe that at the end of the 20th century, profound changes took place in international relations. The Cold War is over. The bipolar system has disappeared. The positive trend of the formation of a multipolar world is rapidly developing, and relations between large states, including between former Cold War adversaries, are changing. Regional economic cooperation organizations are showing significant viability. The diversity of political, economic, and cultural development of all countries is being confirmed, and the role of forces advocating peace and broad international cooperation is growing. An increasing number of countries are coming to a common understanding that mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit are needed, not hegemony. Look how they're using this term, hegemony, in 1997. And power politics, dialogue, and cooperation, not confrontation and conflicts. So the Chinese, in their language in the last 12 months, have been extremely consistent with this document. Building a peaceful, stable, just, and rational new international political and economic order is becoming an urgent requirement of the era and an imperative of historical development. Freaking bold paragraph there. Really bold. Okay? On point number 2, got to think in mind this is 27 years ago, not this year. Point 2, the parties advocate the mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence, and other generally recognized principles of international law become the fundamental norm of conducting interstate relations and the basis for creating a new international order. You've got to remember this part here in relation to what Lavrov says next, 27 years later, today. In this document, it goes on to say, continuing point 2, each state has the right, based on its specific conditions, to independently choose the path of development without interference from other states. Differences in social structure, ideologies, and value systems should not become an obstacle to the development of normal interstate relations. All countries, whether large or small, strong or weak, rich or poor, are equal members of the international community. No country should strive for hegemony, pursue a policy from a position of strength, and monopolize international affairs. The parties believe that the rejection of discriminatory policies and practices in economic relations, the strengthening and expansion of trade, some might say globalization, economic, scientific, technical, and humanitarian exchanges, and cooperation on an equal and mutually beneficial basis will contribute to joint development and prosperity. Just a moment. In point 3, the parties advocate, this is critically important here as well, the adoption of a new comprehensive security concept. They believe it is necessary to put an end to the mentality of the Cold War and oppose the bloc policy. It is necessary to settle differences and disputes between countries in peaceful ways, not to use force or threaten to use it, through dialogue and consultations to promote mutual understanding and trust, and through bilateral and multilateral coordination and cooperation to strive for peace and security. The parties consider the Commonwealth of Independent States as an important factor of stability and development in Eurasia. They emphasize that the agreement between the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, the Republic of Tajikistan, and the People's Republic of China on confidence building in the military field in the border areas, as well as the agreement on mutual reduction of armed forces in the border areas, are important and can serve as a model for achieving regional peace, security, and stability after the end of the Cold War. The parties intend to promote the disarmament process, emphasize the importance of signing the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the implementation of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The parties expressed concern about attempts to expand and strengthen military blocs, i.e. NATO, as this trend may pose a threat to the security of individual countries and escalate tensions on a regional and global scale. How frickin' prescient was that 25 years later in 2002 when NATO was trying to expand to Ukraine? Okay, let's just read that sentence again. The parties expressed concern about attempts to expand and strengthen military blocs, as this trend may pose a threat to the security of individual countries and escalate tensions on a regional and global scale. Point 4. The parties agree that it is necessary to strengthen the role of the United Nations and its Security Council, and positively assess the efforts of the United Nations to maintain peace and security throughout the world. They believe that the place and role of the United Nations in the world as the most universal and authoritative organization consisting of sovereign states cannot be replaced by any other international organization. The parties express confidence that the UN will play an important role in establishing and maintaining a new international order. In that regard, they obviously were very disappointed. In UN peacekeeping efforts, the focus should be on preventing the emergence of conflicts and their proliferation. Peacekeeping operations can only be carried out by a decision of the Security Council and with the consent of the countries concerned. It is not true anymore with Chapter 8, peacemaking operations. In strict accordance with the issued mandate of the Security Council and under its control. In cases where the Security Council, and bear in mind that was completely thrown out the window with the NATO intervention in Kosovo. In cases where the UN Security Council, in accordance with the Charter, decides on the application of sanctions, the damage from their introduction, as well as damage to third countries and neighboring regions, should be minimized. This is a reflection on the All for Food program. The sanctions themselves must be mitigated and lifted in a timely manner as the UN Security Council resolutions are implemented. The parties expressed their readiness to cooperate closely with the United Nations and its specialized agencies and to make efforts to improve the effectiveness of the work of the United Nations. The parties intend to hold regular consultations on relevant issues of the UN's work, taking into account the circumstances and coordinate their actions in this area. So note, in 1997, the Russians and the Chinese said they were going to work together in the United Nations Security Council. And subsequent to this, they elevated their bilateral diplomatic relationship to the status of a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination in the new era. And there you can see that they've talked about the new era, and they're also talking about coordinating their actions. So those exact phrases came from this document 27 years ago. Point 5, the parties emphasized that the broad circles of developing countries and the non-aligned movement are an important force contributing to the formation of a multipolar world and the establishment of a new international order. The interaction of developing countries is increasing. Their role in international politics is increasing, and their share of the global economy is increasing. The rise of developing countries will give a powerful impetus to the historical process of establishing a new international order. Bear in mind, this is translation. So new international order is obviously synonymous with new world order. In the future new international order, these countries should rightfully take their rightful place, participate equally and without any discrimination in international affairs. Point 6. The parties note with satisfaction that the establishment and development of Russian-Chinese relations of an equal and trust-based partnership aimed at strategic cooperation in the 21st century keeps pace with the development of the international situation and international relations after the Cold War. It fully meets the fundamental interests of the peoples of the two countries and contributes to peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region and around the world. Russia and China, which are permanent members of the UN Security Council, adhering to the principles of partnership, good neighborliness and friendship, equality and trust, mutually beneficial cooperation, and joint development, strictly observing the principles of international law, assert long-term interstate relations of a new type, not directed against third countries. This is an important practical experience for establishing a new international order. The parties intend to actively use and strengthen the established system of contacts at the higher and highest levels. The heads of state, heads of government, and foreign ministers of the two countries will regularly exchange views on bilateral relations and important international issues. Guided by a sense of historical responsibility for world peace and development and the future of humanity, the parties are strengthening coordination and cooperation in international affairs. Both sides are making efforts for friendly coexistence and equal cooperation with all other states, making their worthy contribution to the strengthening of world peace and the joint progress of mankind. Very similar to Xi saying a shared future for mankind. So this document says the joint progress of mankind, and Z says the shared future for mankind. It's completely synonymous. It's literally an issue of translation from this document. In point 7, humanity is entering a new era. It's exactly what Z has been saying for 12 years. We're in a new era. The question of what international order people will live in the next century is becoming more and more acute for the peoples of all countries. The party's order, all countries, and I think the word order is mistranslation of suggest or recommend, all countries to launch an active dialogue on the issue of building a peaceful, stable, just, and rational new international order, and are ready to jointly discuss any constructive proposals put forward in this regard. Signed by the People's Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China in Moscow on April 23rd, 1997. And it then says, this is quite humorous, the text of the document is issued in Diplomatic Bulletin number 5 of May 1997. That's the title of the issue, Diplomatic Bulletin number 5. But look at the significance. With the benefit of hindsight, I wasn't aware of this document 25 years ago, and I'm enormously glad to have been able to read it in its entirety to you this evening. Now, simply because it's necessary, I'm going to play the next song regarding the future. And this is called the Cosmonaut song. So the broadcast may actually end at this point. And please be with us when we have to restart it. I appreciate it. It's very, very frustrating indeed, as it is for all of us. But I'm doing my best to try and bring this information to you. So here we go. If we cut off again, then we will go back, and the next segment of this is going to be completing the rest of Sergei Lavrov's speech. Okay, I have music for the end of that. Then we're going to compare or contrast with Stephen Hadley's speech, or rather his essay in Foreign Affairs, and then there'll be some closeout music. So this may end up being in 4 or 5 pieces, and then Sam will patch it together, hopefully. So please bear with us.
Заправлены в планшеты космические карты, и штурман уточняет последний раз маршрут. Давайте-ка, ребята, споемте перед стартом, у нас еще в запасе 14 минут. Я верю, друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды на пыльных тропинках далеких планет. Заправлены в планшеты космические карты, и штурман уточняет последний раз маршрут. Давайте-ка, ребята, споемте перед стартом.
Жить и верить — это замечательно. Перед нами небывалые пути. Утверждают космонавты и мечтатели, что на Марсе будут яблони цвести. Но когда с тобой, товарищи, всю вселенную проехать и пройти, звезды встретятся с землею расцветающей, и на Марсе будут яблони цвести. Я со звездами сдружился дальними. Не волнуйся обо мне и не грусти. Покидая нашу землю, обещали мы, что на Марсе будут яблони цвести. Покидая нашу землю, обещали мы, что на Марсе будут яблони цвести.
So hopefully you can now hear me as we continue on. The technical glitches on Restream are very, very difficult indeed tonight. So thank you for staying with us. The second song, which was the Soviet cosmonaut song, according to Restream, didn't want to play. So the version that I just played there now was actually called On Mars There Will Be Apple Blossom. Quite extraordinary. And definitely seems to be one of the goals of Elon Musk. And who knows, rather than fleeing to Russia, possibly he'll just flee to Mars. Who knows if he'll go on a TR-3B. And so we're going to return to the Lavrov document that amazingly is still available on the net. Lavrov continues by saying, and just going to check here with Sam that the audio is coming through clearly. So Lavrov continues to say, the global balance of power is undergoing revolutionary changes. This is due to the objective trends in the development of the world economy, where the positions of the states of the global south and east and the global majority as a whole are strengthening. The share of the BRICS countries in the world GDP at purchasing power parity at the end of 2024 will be about 37%. It confidently exceeds the share of the G7, that is about 30% as of the end of 2023. This economic rise allows an increasing number of non-Western states to consistently strengthen their sovereignty and, in practice, to implement a nationally oriented course in both foreign and domestic policy. Just like Russia, these countries are increasingly advocating for the democratization of international relations and a multipolar world, becoming more and more resistant to external interference, exactly as was described in that 97 document. It's staggering to look back upon a document that old and see that this is literally playing out in 2024. This is also reflected, Lavrov continues to say today, in practical politics. It is manifested, first of all, in the growing interest in such associations as the SCO and BRICS. So that goes to indicate the significance of the Kazan meeting. It's just, one more confirmation of how Sam and I are trying to bring this information to you. And whilst people did pay attention to BRICS, they, in some regards, didn't understand the historical manifestation. Lavrov continues, I am sure that everyone was impressed by the Kazan summit, which was attended by delegations from 36 countries. The association received more than 30 applications with requests either for membership or for the establishment of special relations. It is safe to say that the strengthening of BRICS has become one of the driving forces behind the formation of a polycentric, which is a synonym for multipolar, world order, which has both ardent supporters and open opponents. And we understand this, is ready to accept the natural course of things. The Western community, which at one time broke out as a result of known historical events, both great geographical discoveries, the development of capitalism, and the creation of its well-being, largely at the expense of colonial empires, would like to retain its privileged position forever. In the United States and its subordinate countries, the West revived the spirit of the Cold War and in their doctrinal documents declare the need to eliminate certain threats to their domination from Russia, China, and other countries pursuing an independent foreign policy. We're going to see this in the Hadley essay. It's really extremely relevant, this. Now, bear in mind the Hadley document was published on the 1st of November and was no doubt submitted a week or two beforehand. So it's not a direct response to this speech, but in terms of the conflicting policies, it is definitely a riposte. After the start of the special military operation in Ukraine, Washington and its satellites carried out a real sanctions aggression against Russia as part of their hybrid war. Over the past 10 years, this number is quite incredible, more than 21,000 sanctions have been imposed against our country, Russia, in the field of economy, finance, trade, investment, mass media, culture, sports, and in general, people-to-people contacts. Developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America suffer primarily from such neo-colonial practices of the West. The extraterritorial application of unilateral restrictions harm the poorest states, depriving them of available energy resources, food, fertilizers, and basic technologies, not to mention advanced scientific achievements and developments. The downside of the fight against the undesirable is that the West cuts the branch upon which it itself sits and thus destroys the global system of division of labor, which has been spreading to the whole world since the early 1990s. Western capitals overnight forgot about such principles as fair competition, the inviolability of property, presumption of innocence, and many others. The dollar, which has been advertised to us for decades as the common property of mankind, was turned into a weapon of suppression and punishment of geopolitical competitors and disobedient people. Thus, in fact, it was sentenced as a, not sentenced, it was condemned as a world reserve currency and a means of international settlement. As a result, the United States and its allies themselves are collapsing the system of globalization, which was cherished and advertised to the whole world. It's what the lady deputy head of I think it's the IMF, calls fragmentation. He continues, I want to remind you of the words of President Putin, which he said during the Kazan summit. The BRICS is developing alternative payment platforms, new interbank settlement systems, and is by no means against the dollar. The United States itself is withdrawing the dollar from circulation as more and more countries begin to fear that they may be next. No one knows how they can be punished and from what leg the head of a particular government department in the United States will stand up. When economic pressure does not work and truly sovereign countries cannot be influenced, the West, led by the United States, does not refrain from resorting to threats, blackmail, or even the use of force. Power pressure takes different forms. After 2022, the goal of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia was proclaimed. It is indicative that London and Washington had similar plans back in May 1945, when, until the end of World War II, they were developing what is known as Operation Unthinkable to destroy or dismember the Soviet Union, their ally, in the fight against fascism. I would recommend that people look that up. Operation Unthinkable. That literally was a discussion about, and that Patton was advocating as well, about rolling straight on into Russia whilst the British and the Americans had their massive armies at the time. Today, the Anglo-Saxons expect to defeat our country with the hands of the Kiev regime in the same way as Adolf Hitler, having gathered most European countries under the Nazi banner. That's very true. As a backup option in case Zelensky's regime fails, they are preparing. This is a critical point here, real critical point. And we're seeing this in the new document from the former president of Finland, which is 165 pages long, which we'll get into after the election. And Lavrov says, as a backup option in case of Zelensky's regime failing, the Europeans are preparing, and the Americans, continental Europe to rush into a suicidal adventure and enter into a direct armed conflict with Russia. So they're not even saying that's a possibility. You've got lots of top generals like in Norway and Sweden and Germany and Britain saying that it's inevitable and will occur within 5 years. It is sad that the current ruling elites, Lavrov continues, of many European countries clearly do not see a future for themselves in a multipolar world and seek salvation from the overseas hegemon. This is a key point that has been made recently by Hungary. Hungary is looking to the future and to joining, assuming the whole world doesn't mean nuked, the Greater Eurasian Partnership. It's clearly identified that that is in the interests of its people, whereas the Germans are going headlong into a NATO suicide plan. The German government shamefully resigned itself to the humiliating destruction of the Nord Stream gas pipelines to the detriment of the fundamental interests of the German economy and people. Now, Berlin was taken under the canopy when the United States announced the decision to deploy American medium-range nuclear missiles on German territory. Chancellor Scholz only called such a decision good. Reckless proposals for strikes by Western long-range systems deep into Russian territory are being thrown in. I won't talk about the meaninglessness of the very idea of fighting to victory with Russia. At the very least, this will sharply reduce the chances of potential participants in any such war for a role in the multipolar future. This is a key point there, particularly in relation to Britain, but other NATO countries as well. Putin has said, and Lavrov has confirmed, that the Greater Eurasian Partnership is open to Western European membership, but he's clearly expressing there that that's going to be dependent upon what they do in relation to Ukraine. The desperation of the situation in which the Western elites find themselves is expressed in the increasingly less rational behaviour of the states they led. The West, and primarily the Anglo-Saxons, which he means the Americans and British, is always feeling they have not enough. The war they unleashed against Russia in Europe is not enough. In July this year, at the summit in Washington, NATO leaders approved claims to the dominant role of the alliance not only in the Euro-Atlantic, but also in the Asia-Pacific region. If you read the NATO declaration, it turns out that in order to protect the territory of its members, this, I remind you again, supposedly defensive alliance is going to conduct defensive battles in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait, thousands of miles from its shores. All, just a moment here, I'm just going to quickly communicate. It's very difficult trying to do this when we're several thousand miles apart and experiencing really, really severe technical problems. Lavrov goes on to say, all sane observers understand that this is a way to nowhere, a path to nowhere. However, the Americans are purposefully introducing NATO military infrastructure into the Pacific Ocean without hiding the goal of increasing pressure on China, North Korea, and Russia. At the same time, the ASEAN-ocentric architecture of regional security and cooperation in Southeast Asia, which has been built on the basis of equality, consideration of mutual interests, and consensus for decades, is being undermined. To replace the open mechanisms created around ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the United States and its allies are establishing small geometry alliances, Mercurius were like that, such as AUKUS, the Quad, and various 4s and 3s, with the involvement of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And notice once again, as he did in Minsk, even though India is a named member of the Quad, Lavrov fails to mention India by name. He goes on to say they are also trying to drag some ASEAN members there with a sight or vision to collapse this association. And by that, he's referring to the Philippines, in order to eliminate the competitor to the bloc pro-Western configurations. Obsession with the desire to control everything has led to the series of tragedies in the Middle East. This is both the US intervention in Iraq under the false slogan of finding non-existent weapons of mass destruction, and the destruction of the Libyan statehood, with tragic consequences not only for that country, but also for North Africa and the Sahel region. This year, another independent UN member state, Yemen, was subjected to Anglo-Saxon aggression. So far, the Syrian Arab Republic has not been able to recover from American interference. Do we have some audio now? Yes, we do. Okay, we've returned to the stream. Staggering amount of technical problems tonight, more than we've ever experienced. I'm going to go back a couple of paragraphs, so forgive me if you've already heard this, but I understand that I dropped out of the stream. I've had to re-enter the stream. So Lavrov said, reckless proposals for strikes by Western long-range systems deep into Russian territory are being thrown in. I won't talk about the meaninglessness of the very idea of fighting until victory with Russia, which would trigger the Russian revised policy on the use of nuclear weapons. At the very least, this will sharply reduce the chances of potential participants in such a war for any role in the multipolar future. It's clearly not the path that Hungary has decided to embark upon. They are fully intended on signing up for the Greater Eurasian Partnership, the very wise first of the European countries to jump ship. The desperation of the situation in which the Western elites find themselves is expressed in the increasingly less rational behavior of the states that they lead. The West, and primarily the Anglo-Saxons, which is the British and Americans, is always feeling they have not enough. The war they unleashed against Russia in Europe is not enough. In July this year, at the summit in Washington, NATO leaders approved claims for the dominant role of the alliance not only in the Euro-Atlantic, but also in the Asia-Pacific region. If you read the NATO declaration, it turns out that in order to protect the territory of its members, this, and I remind you, defensive alliance is going to conduct defensive battles in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait, thousands of miles from their own shores. All sane observers understand that this is a path to nowhere. However, the Americans are purposely introducing NATO military infrastructure in the Pacific Ocean without hiding the goal of increasing pressure on China, North Korea, and Russia. At the same time, the Asianocentric architecture of regional security and cooperation in Southeast Asia, which has been built on the basis of equality, consideration of mutual interests, and consensus for decades, is being undermined. To replace the open mechanisms created around the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the United States and its allies are establishing small geometry alliances such as AUKUS, the Quad, and various 4s and 3s with the involvement of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Note here, Lavrov does not, for the second time in a week, include the name India, but India is clearly part of that structure in the Quad. They are also trying to drag some ASEAN members, in this regard he's thinking of the Philippines no doubt, with a sight to the collapse of the association in order to eliminate the competitor to the bloc pro-Western configurations. Obsession with the desire to control everything, and this has led to a series of tragedies in the Middle East. This is both the US intervention in Iraq under the false slogan of finding non-existent weapons of mass destruction, and the destruction of Libyan statehood, with tragic consequences not only for this country but also for North Africa and the Sahel region. This year, another independent UN member state, Yemen, was subjected to Anglo-Saxon aggression. So far, the Arab Syrian Republic cannot recover from American interference, and indeed we learned yesterday that the Americans are reinforcing their military bases inside Syria. The Americans have actually blocked all multilateral mechanisms to promote the Palestinian-Israeli settlement. First of all, this concerned the work of the Quartet, which included Russia, the United States, the UN, and the European Union. Now Washington continues to try to monopolize mediation efforts, and it organizes improvised negotiation formats, throws in new proposals that will allegedly stop the bloodshed in Gaza and Lebanon. Against the background of such mediation, the number of victims is growing catastrophically. These are mostly peaceful people, women, children, and old. At the same time, the West stubbornly avoids recognizing the facts. In year one of Israel's operation, twice as many Palestinian civilians and Lebanese were killed as indeed the number of civilian casualties on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine in a total of 10 years after the neo-Nazi coup in 2014. Almost twice as much in a year as in 10 years in the other conflict. When Americans and their satellites deal with international and regional problems, they think about one thing: how to maintain their privileged position and lead everything. They pay little attention to the fate and lives of ordinary people. But the most serious challenges facing the world require equal, joint efforts, not submission to those who long for global domination. That's an important phrase there in relation to what Hadley says about the Chinese in his upcoming essay that I'll read next. In addition to armed conflicts, this also concerns the need to ensure democratic methods of legal regulation of the use of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, that the Biden administration signed an executive order in relation to the Defense Department just this week. Adaptation to climate change and joint exploration of outer space, prevention of epidemics of infectious diseases, and the World Health Organization is today launching a 10-day effort to wrap up the pandemic treaty with massive peer pressure on the other delegates. It's going to be really interesting to see if Russia and potentially other BRICS nations block that. Lavrov continues, overcoming socioeconomic and digital inequalities and combating hunger and poverty, and many other areas on which the future of mankind depends. And you'll recall that in the 1997 document, it referred to the progress of mankind. Lavrov continues, an unambiguous conclusion can be drawn from our diplomatic context, including at the BRICS summit in Kazan. It is obvious to the countries of the world majority that confrontation and hegemonism are harmful and do not solve any of the problems. The global South and the global East are increasingly defending their right to full participation in decision-making processes across the spectrum of international life. Let's just check that the broadcast is still coming out live, loud and clear. It appears to be. Thank you for all of those who have persisted with this despite the numerous problems. He goes on to say, as a result of the increase in foreign policy activity of non-Western countries, the role of regional and interregional interstate associations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America is being strengthened. In Eurasia, these are, first of all, this is an incredibly important list, very, very important, so please listen up carefully to this. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the League of Arab States, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. In the same row is the Chinese project One Belt, One Road, otherwise known as the Belt and Road Initiative. As for Africa, members of the African Union are increasingly, consistently striving to ensure that the continent's rich resources are exported to world markets, not in the form of raw materials, but as high value added goods. Such a step to stop neo-colonial practices will radically change the economic balance with Western countries in favor of Africans. Similar processes are gaining momentum in Latin America and Asia, which has been the engine of the world economy for many years. An important step on the way to multipolarity should be the establishment of direct contacts, horizontal ties between all regional integration structures, both among themselves and with BRICS, where the main states play the role of leaders in their regions and are already represented at the global level. BRICS can serve as a harmonizing structure, allowing to gently coordinate the approaches of integration associations of the global south and east. Another direction of action is de-dollarization in the international financial and economic system. Let me remind you that the share of national currencies in Russia's settlements with SCO countries and the Eurasian Economic Union has exceeded 90%. And with the BRICS countries, we are reaching a level of about 65%. And this figure is growing. Russia will continue to play its important role in this process, given our position as the fourth largest world economy, according to the International Monetary Fund, judging by purchasing power parity, and the largest world resource power. Work on the creation of a new payment platform was started in BRICS under the Russian presidency and will be continued by our Brazilian successors in 2025. Some experts predict not only the strengthening of the role of national and regional currencies in international trade, but also the formation of several macro regions with their own standards, regulatory norms, and value chains in conditions where, due to the selfish actions of the United States, the once global system is rapidly fragmenting. Confidence in the dollar is rapidly falling. In any event, we will continue to strengthen the mechanisms of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to increase ties with other members of other integration structures, both on the Eurasian continent and in other parts of the world, opening up new horizons of mutually beneficial, truly equal cooperation. It will bring dividends to all participants without exception. In this content, and obviously this is my pet favorite, Lavrov says, we will continue to promote the concept of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. Its formation will create a material foundation for the other implementation of the initiative of Russian President Putin on the construction of an architecture of equal and indivisible security in Eurasia, open to all states and associations of our continent without exception, ready to work together to find generally acceptable solutions. This topic was specifically devoted to in the very productive International Conference on European Security held recently in Minsk, with the participation of many Eurasian countries, associations, and delegations from all parts of the continent, including Western Europe. And I read out in its entirety Lavrov's speech at that event, which was only half this length, about 18 minutes. We want the countries of the Eurasian continent, the largest, fastest growing, and richest in natural resources, to determine their own destiny without outside interference, exactly relating to the 97 document, and solve their problems in such a way that Greater Eurasia contributes to the construction of a sustainable multipolar world. I would like to emphasize that we do not close ourselves from dialogue with the West although we will make the necessary conclusions from how Western neighbours overnight abandon us from their promises, commitments, and agreements. What matters is how they demonstrated and how they undermined confidence in themselves. If and when they mature to resume contacts and build relations on the principles of mutual respect with an honest balance of interests, we will be determined to treat such proposals based upon Russia's national interests and not only on those wanters or demanders that we periodically hear from Western capitals. In July this year, under our chairmanship, the UN Security Council held an open debate on the principles of coexistence of states in a multipolar world. We have proposed for discussion a number of concrete steps aimed at restoring confidence and stabilizing the international situation. We will continue this dialogue on other multilateral platforms, including later this month in Rio de Janeiro, at the G20 summit. So far, at the intergovernmental official level, the conversation is restricted. The West is trying to reap unilateral advantages for itself, not refraining from any methods, including, and I emphasize this with particular regret, the privatization or domination of the secretariats of international organizations. This is clearly manifested both in the activities of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe and in the work of the United Nations Secretariat, where due to outdated and ineffective criteria for the staffing of the Secretariat, Western representatives have prevailed in all key departments of this respected structure. Unfortunately, the leaders of the OSCE and the UN Secretariat have begun to play along with the interests of the West in an unsightly manner. On the way here, I read the RIA Novosti message, which reported on the statement of the official representative of the UN Secretary General at a press briefing. Answering the question about what the Secretary General thinks about the reports on the plans of Russia and North Korea in the military field, the representative said that these reports cause the Secretary General deep concern because they will lead to the internationalization of the Ukrainian crisis. Therefore, the Secretary General firmly and resolutely advocates that the Ukrainian conflict be resolved on the basis of the UN Charter, international law, and the General Assembly resolutions. In this regard, Lavrov says two comments. First, the Secretary General has recalled internationalization almost 3 years after the West prepared for Ukraine for the war and has led it directly on the ground. The facts have long been cited many times, but then the leadership of the UN Secretariat did not worry about internationalization. Secondly, we all want to be guided by the UN Charter as called for by the SecGen and relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. Let me remind you that when the West, with the full support of the Secretariat of the UN, demands the restoration of Ukraine to the borders of 1991, it refers to the principle of the Charter on respect for the territorial integrity of all states, as well as a series of resolutions that were adopted by vote with a split of UN members, but in support of Ukrainian calls to restore territorial integrity. Everything seems to be the same. The Charter also contains such a provision in the UN General Assembly resolution. Part of the truth is worse than a lie. The Charter, before mentioning territorial integrity, recognizes the right of the nation to self-determination, which has served as the basis for the greatest process of decolonization in recent history. It is the right of the nation to self-determination. Among the resolutions of the UN General Assembly, long before the Ukrainian events, in 1970, we have the detailed Declaration on Principles of International Law relating to friendly relations and cooperation between states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. This was adopted by consensus, which states that everyone is obliged to respect the territorial integrity of those states that respect the right of the nation to self-determination and therefore have governments representing the entire population living in their territory. It was a UN General Assembly resolution, unlike those that were provocatively thrown in after the start of the special military operation and voted, though about a third of UN members did not support them, and in some cases even half, the declaration that I have quoted being adopted by consensus. The putschists who committed a coup d'etat in February 1914 in violation of the agreements which the legitimate authorities had signed, they seized state institutions by force and declared as their first goal the elimination of the status of the Russian language in Ukraine and announced a campaign to Crimea of militants who were heading there in friendship trains in order to storm the building of the Supreme Council. Did these people represent the population of Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya? No, of course not. The UN Secretary General needs to set up his official representative for a clearer presentation and interpretation of international law by the United Nations Secretariat. The UN Charter should be read in full, not just the part that one wishes to emphasize in this conflict today. In 2008, Western countries declared Kosovo independent. In the West, no one even argued about it. The International Court of Justice of the United Nations, in its opinion, said, this is often quoted by Russian President Putin, that if any part of the state unilaterally decided to declare its independence, the consent of the central authorities is completely unnecessary, which would seem to be directly relevant to the successionist moves of the 4 oblasts of Ukraine, plus, of course, the island of Crimea. Even abstracting from this, the first article of the UN Charter, and it is impossible to pass by it if you seriously read this document, states that everyone is obliged to respect the rights of any person, regardless of race, sex, language, and religion. This is the UN Charter, whose leadership is called by the Secretary General regarding the Ukrainian conflict. I have not heard a single comment from the mouth of his official representative that would concern the legislative extermination of the Russian language in Ukraine in all spheres of life, in the field of education, culture, media, and in everyday life. I also did not hear a single statement regarding the recently adopted law on the liquidation of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. All this, both language and religion, according to the UN Charter, must be sacredly respected. Secretary General Guterres is the chief advisor for the implementation of the Charter. People often ask, what will be the international legal basis of multipolarity? There is no need to look for any new principles. All of them are in the UN Charter. The trouble is that our Western partners have never fully respected these principles. Let me remind you that the key principle of the Charter states the UN is based on the sovereign equality of states. Run in your mind the history of various conflicts, crises after the creation of the UN. In none of them were the United States or its Western allies guided by the principle of sovereign equality of states. They did not respect a partner who would be equal. We consider it a great achievement that the Kazan Declaration, unanimously adopted by the leaders at the BRICS summit, states, and here specifically in connection with the Ukrainian crisis, the need to respect the goals and principles of the UN Charter in all their fullness and interrelationship, and not selectively, which we now unfortunately observe. Today, in the era of rapid change, we are interested in scientists, thinkers, futurologists, and as they say, visionaries with imagination and the ability to think outside the box and to look beyond the horizon, as cited by President Putin in his remarks today, and to contribute to the understanding of current processes, forecasting, and modeling new forms of international life, which will correspond to the changed realities, and in my opinion, should be based upon the permanent principles of the Charter of the United Nations. If they are not fulfilled, it is not because they are bad or unfair, they are just fair, and that is why the West does not want to fulfill them. Justice is not a characteristic of the world system that the West created and which they would like to preserve, in spite of objective historical trends in strengthening multipolarity. We believe that in such work it is important to start from facts and sober analysis, but at the same time be both bold in formulating ideas that would then form the basis of the desired image of the future. This is why you have been invited to talk here. Russia is ready to participate in the group of countries that show intellectual leadership. All of the 1,000-year experience of statehood and achievements of our state, which will be vividly presented in the National Center of Russia, should serve as a powerful incentive for the creative activity of our civil society. If there is such activity, it always manifests itself in fateful times. And then I can assure you that diplomats will be your most reliable allies. In conclusion, I want to say the following. This symposium is called science fiction, but I have no doubt that its scientificity is guaranteed by the high quality and reputation of the experts gathered here from many countries. As for the fantastic dimension of your agenda, the discussions here will surely give food for thought to practicing politicians. Wanting to contribute to the search for fantastic plots, I risk inviting you to think about when and if the West will come to its senses, and when its conscience will wake up. Such a plot, I think, would be interesting. When the West, and there are still many smart people there, will realize that neo-colonial twists are harmful, including for the West itself, that arrogance destroys its reputation. Remember, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Mr. Joseph Borrell, said, "Europe is a flowering garden and around it is a jungle." And US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, "Everyone who will not be at the democracy table will be on the menu." That is a direct quote. I was horrified when I read it. I will also call on to fantasize the topic of what should be done by the countries of the world majority in order to accelerate the process of admonishing our Western colleagues who, including for the sake of their own peoples, must realize that it is necessary to behave decently. And that, I'm pleased to say, brings us to the end of Sergei Lavrov's address at this international symposium today. See that lots and lots and lots of tie-ins with the 1997 document that I read out to you previously. Now I'm going to attempt to play the second song again that when I first played it wouldn't play, and this is the Cosmonauts song of the Soviet Space Forces. Let's see if this will play.
Жить и верить — это замечательно. Перед нами небывалые пути. Утверждают космонавты и мечтатели, что на Марсе будут яблони цвести. Хорошо, когда с тобой, товарищи, всю вселенную проехать и пройти. Звезды встретятся с землею расцветающей, и на Марсе будут яблони цвести. Я со звездами сдружился дальними. Не волнуйся обо мне и не грусти. Покидая нашу землю, обещали мы, что на Марсе будут яблони цвести. Покидая нашу землю, обещали мы, что на Марсе будут яблони цвести.
That was a particularly beautiful rendition of that. I hope the subtitles were visible to you. If not, we may have to edit those in. Unfortunately, on some of these YouTube versions of the old Soviet songs, the subtitles are right at the bottom of the page and they're really tiny, which makes them hard to see. But we shall endeavor on. So, having brought to you the address of President Putin, the speech of Sergei Lavrov, interrupted by the recounting of the full version of the 1997 Sino-Russian agreement on the importance of multipolarity in creating a new international order, then finishing with Sergei Lavrov's comments. We're now going to look at Stephen Hadley's astonishing article in Foreign Affairs. Forgive me if I'm occasionally yawning. It's not because I'm bored. It's just because I've not had sufficient sleep in the last 2 or 3 days, trying to keep up with all the news, and really am working very, very hard to bring you this information. And despite the technical details, I hope it's been of interest to people and we can clean up some of the glitches in the re-editing. I would please remind people that we do depend upon you to share this information by retweeting or reposting, or simply sending links to your friends and family. But really, retweeting on X in particular is essential to help us defeat the censorship algorithm. And despite the difficulties, we have to pay just under like $490 a year to be able to broadcast to 7 or 8 platforms at once on Restream. And the payment for that is due in a few weeks. So we very kindly had another $25 donation from somebody yesterday. We're now $330 towards our $600 fundraising goal before the end of the year. So if you can possibly go to weaponizednews.com in the top right hand corner or very top of the page, depending on whether you're looking at it on a phone or on a laptop, you'll see that there's a donate button, and there you can make a payment with PayPal, credit card, debit card, in a secure manner. We don't ever get all of your personal information in that regard, and that would be enormously helpful and indeed essential to us in order to be able to continue this service in the new year without getting the additional $270. It really would be unfair to expect us to not only cross-subsidize this, but just continue working for $0 and trying to avoid putting all this information behind a paywall. So we just need a few additional contributions. Another 11 people at $25 each will be sufficient to get us to that goal. That really, given that we've got, almost 12,000 people following Weaponized News on Twitter, 1,500 on Facebook, a few hundred on YouTube, a few hundred on BitChute, 750 on Rumble, it really should not be a problem hitting that goal. I appreciate it's not as smooth as one would like, but it's been done on a shoestring budget by 2 people on a purely voluntary basis. All we're asking at this point is simply to cover the costs of the subscription services, including the Twitter Premium Plus. It's not any personal profit on our part. And as you can see tonight, I'm doing hours of broadcast, persisting with the difficulties, which haven't been as prevalent before. We really haven't had this problem. And so please do be part of the team. Obviously, as we repeatedly say, you are part of the resistance if you're receiving this broadcast, like they say in the movie Terminator. And sometimes it's necessary to prove it. But anyway, going on to the next document, and I can't tell you how. I won't even comment. I'll comment at the end, and you can form your own opinion as we go along. Okay, so this is dated the 1st November. It's published in Foreign Affairs, which is the bi-monthly magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's entitled Xi Jinping's Axis of Losers. And the subtitle is The Right Way to Thwart the New Autocratic Convergence. It's by Stephen Hadley. There's a picture of Putin and Xi looking at each other with a translator operating on their behalf. The picture's from Kazan in Russia in October of this year. Mr. Hadley writes, the United States is contending with the most challenging international environment it has faced since the Cold War and perhaps since World War II. One of the most disconcerting features of this environment is the burgeoning cooperation amongst China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Some policymakers and commentators see in this cooperation the beginnings of a 21st century axis, one that, like the German, Italian, Japanese axis of the 20th century, will plunge the world into a global war. Others foresee not World War III, but a slew of separate conflicts scattered around the globe. Either way, the result is a world at war. The situation is that serious. What should be done about this cooperation is another matter. Some strategists argue for ruthless prioritization, focusing on the members of the axis that represent the greatest threats. This is the idea that America should be focused on China. Others believe that only a comprehensive effort will succeed. But the best strategy would borrow elements of both approaches, acknowledging that China is the primary long-term concern for US national security strategy, the pacing threat in the US Defense Department's framing, but also a different kind of global actor than its rogue state partners. Accordingly, it is suggested Washington's aim should be to make clear to the Chinese President Xi Jinping how counterproductive and costly to Beijing's interest these new relationships will turn out to be. That means effectively countering Iran, North Korea, and Russia in their own regions, thereby demonstrating to China that tethering itself to a bunch of losers is hardly a path to global influence. There, I can't resist commenting. It's staggering that this deep state establishment individual is suggesting that the way they break apart the axis, as he calls it, is by persuading Xi Jinping that his three best buddies are all losers and they'll look much cooler in the global high school if they ditch their loser friends. It's ludicrously simplistic. So, gulp of rosé. One moment, please. Mr. Hadley continues in this subsection entitled Brothers in Arms. Cooperation amongst the members of this 21st century axis has been heavily centered on military, industrial, and economic support for Russia in its war on Ukraine, which could not be sustained without such help. Now, once again, this has been a American allegation for some period now, quite vigorously disputed by the Chinese, though you can draw your own conclusions about that. He says the resulting defense industrial cooperation and incipient integration, it's a key recognition there, is likely to go well beyond what existed amongst the 20th century Axis partners. North Korea is providing artillery shells, other munitions, and military personnel, and industrial workers to Russia, and getting oil and missile and space technology in return. Iran is providing missiles and drones produced in its defense plants, as well as helping build such plants in Russia itself, and getting assistance with its own missile, drone, and space programs, and perhaps with civil nuclear power as well. You can see how I keep on referring to the Soviet space music. China is so far providing everything short of actual weapons, dramatically increased trade and purchases of oil, gas, and other natural resources, and dual-use technology that is being integrated into Russian air defense, electronic warfare, drone and other weapons, and communication systems, and as of recently, actual components for Russian weapons. There is even talk of producing drone and weapons systems for Russia in Chinese factories. What Russia is getting in return is not fully clear at this point, aside from discounted energy and potentially unrivaled influence over Russia. Beyond the war in Ukraine, China and Russia and their Axis partners have increased joint training and operations, including with bombers, ships, and even ground forces. The Axis partners have also accelerated their diplomatic coordination, with Beijing and Moscow using their veto power in the UN Security Council to protect each other and Tehran and Pyongyang from adverse resolutions. Reciprocal, high-level visits by leaders and top officials have yielded a series of agreements to cooperate in economic, technological, and other fields. As Secretary Blinken repeatedly tells us that is their right to do. Completely ignored by Mr. Hadley here. This 21st century axis may not be a formal alliance, but it nonetheless represents an increasingly close, highly functional and flexible alignment of interests that does not need to become an alliance to advance its members' aims or undermine the interests of the United States and its allies in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Even without real ideological affinity, there is shared anti-Westernism, opposition to democracy, and embrace of authoritarian alternatives. What truly binds the Axis is not ideology, but a common opposition to US power and the international system it sustains, fueled by a belief that this power represents a mortal threat to their regime's interest, aspirations, and even survival. So there's a real disconnect between Hadley's view of the international system, which is undoubtedly the rules-based international order, and Lavrov, for example, reflection on the world order and the essential nature of the UN Charter and international law. Okay, there's a big philosophical disconnect there. The link, Mr. Hadley continues, between China and Russia is especially important. It is built on the strong personal relationship between Xi and President Putin. That's very true. Forged in more than 60 meetings during their time in office. I think that number's a touch on the high side. It's more like 40. 60 is a real high number. There are, of course, both historical and contemporary sources of tension between China and Russia. A long common border with lots of empty space on the Russian side and a large population on the Chinese side. Beijing's suspicion of Moscow's revived relationship with North Korea and Moscow's suspicion of Beijing's growing economic influence in Central Asia and the considerable xenophobia in both countries. I would disagree with the xenophobia completely. I think there's an incredible degree of harmony in teaching each other's languages in the respective countries. Huge amount of people-to-people exchanges, $225 billion of bilateral trade. It is a burgeoning and fruitful relationship. He goes on to say or suggest that these tensions, although real, are unlikely to be allowed to disrupt the relationship between the two governments as long as Putin and Xi are in charge. But as we saw from the 1997 document, this process was initiated before either of them had risen to their respective presidencies. It's a 25-year plus process and is destined to go on for at least the next 10 years that both of them are likely to remain as president. Next category or next subsection entitled the China card. Although some commentators have recommended trying to pull the members of the Axis apart, former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, with whom he's a business partner without stating it in this article, she leans in the opposite direction, proposing that policymakers seek to slam them together and make them deal with the consequences of the fact they actually don't have all that much in common. Seems fantastically foolish, as said by Kissinger. Hadley, though, says there is much to be said for this approach. Any effort to pry Putin away from the Axis will most certainly fail. He is too dependent on these partners for support in Ukraine. To try to separate North Korea or Iran from the Axis would require concessions that no US administration is likely to be willing to make. But China may be a different matter. Unlike its Axis partners, China is integrated into the global economy. The prospect of broad secondary sanctions, which have been limited and targeted so far, in the event that China crosses Western red lines by providing weapons to Russia, could threaten to exact real economic costs. Meanwhile, the war on Israel being waged by Iran and its proxies threatens to disrupt China's critical oil supplies. Well, a lot of the oil actually comes directly from Iran, so it's very unlikely that Iran would shut off its shipments to China. North Korea's increasingly bellicose attitude towards its neighbors has roiled China's diplomatic and economic relations with South Korea and Japan. And more fundamentally, China has made its prestige hostage to the success of its Axis partners. If they should be seen to be failing in their respective efforts to impose their will on their neighbors by force, it would become clear to the world that Beijing has cast its lot with losers. It's like an act or a scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That would not only undermine China's effort to project itself as the global leader of the new kind of international order, literally from the 97 document, new kind of international order as opposed to new international order. It is exactly the same. It would also damage Xi's personal standing at home and abroad. Next section is entitled, Washington should demonstrate to China that tethering itself to a bunch of losers is hardly a path to global influence. This is utterly delusional. How might this goal be accomplished? With respect to Russia, it means preventing Putin from achieving his strategic objectives in Ukraine. This will require enough sustained Western diplomatic, economic, and military support to enable Ukrainian forces to stop the current Russian advance. Even though we've heard today from the New York Times and the Institute for Study of War and the Wall Street Journal that the Russians are advancing relentlessly. And if not win back occupied territory, then at least establish a stable line of contact between Ukrainian and Russian forces. Such an outcome would allow Kiev to get on with the job of building a sovereign, prosperous, non-corrupt, and democratic state, despite having no elections, increasingly integrated with European economic and security institutions. With respect to Tehran, it means quashing Tehran's hegemonic ambitions in the Mideast. That is total projection, since Israel is part way of pursuing their goal for Eretz Israel, otherwise known as Greater Israel. It's this incredible projection on Headley's part. In part, this can be done by supporting Israel in delivering strong blows against both Iran and its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and more, to re-establish deterrence and open the way to a more stable Middle East. Stability will allow continued reconciliation between Israel and its Arab neighbours and the beginning of a more promising future for the Palestinians and the chance for the people of Lebanon to free their country from domination by Hezbollah. So that's what the US ambassador is trying to do in Lebanon, that she's literally trying to trigger a sectarian civil war there. And this idea that there's going to be reconciliation between Israel and its Arab neighbors whilst they're engaging in genocide is absolutely and utterly ludicrous. And even if there were to be a ceasefire, we've had many countries, including Qatar and Kuwait and Oman and Saudi Arabia, saying that they will not normalize relations with Israel in the absence of the completion of the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which requires a two-state solution. This is totally and utterly ridiculous statement here from Hadley. With respect to North Korea, it means demonstrating that Pyongyang's fixation on nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them will not bring the country security or leverage over its neighbors. Yes, it will. That's exactly the reason why they're doing it. It's what Gaddafi gave up, and then he got a bayonet up his arse. That will require strengthening the diplomatic, economic, and military capabilities of Australia, Japan, South Korea, and other regional allies and partners to work with the United States to deter North Korea and defend against any military action it might undertake, all with the aim of continuing progress towards a free, open, and peaceful Indo-Pacific. So notice there, very interestingly, that like Lavrov, Hadley names the military bloc, names most of the partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, but does not specifically name India. Doesn't say it. The next chapter we go on to is called Existential Reconsiderations. And he says, each of these steps would advance the interests of the United States and its friends and allies, leaving aside the message that they would send China. But if pursued successfully, they would cause Beijing to limit and ultimately reduce its commitment to the failing adventurism of its renegade partners. Absolutely do not see that occurring. There is good reason to think that such a reconsideration is possible, since Xi has adjusted course under pressure before. Now, as any financial advisor will tell you, past performance is not a guarantee for future performance. Faced with street demonstrations and other clear expressions of public dissatisfaction, President Xi abruptly abandoned his zero COVID policy. In response to the China strategy forged over the course of the Trump and Biden administrations, Xi changed his approach to the United States. Early in his tenure, Xi seemed to have concluded that the United States and the West more generally were in terminal decline. One might indeed have thought that after 8 years of Obama, and therefore presented an opportunity for China to assert itself on the global stage. A strong US response, backed by a clear, bipartisan consensus, real strategic investment, and a common front with friends and allies, prompted Xi to reconsider. The result was a decision to re-engage with the United States, including by meeting with President Joe Biden in San Francisco last November, in an attempt to arrest the decline in US-Chinese relations. Personally, I would suggest that Biden and Blinken were fantastically desperate to achieve that. So I wouldn't say it was the Chinese that were trying to engineer that result solely, by far. By decisively curbing the adventurism of Xi's Axis partners, Washington could cause him to change course once again. It would surely be in his interest to do so, for if the recklessness of his partners brings sustained global instability and conflict, Xi himself would bear much of the blame for preventing the Communist Party from fulfilling its pledges to make China a moderately developed economy by 2035 and a strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and modern socialist country by 2049, which is a quarter of a century away. So you can see the long-term nature of these, even as recognized by globalists like Hadley. The right US strategy could make Xi understand that he can best serve his own interests by breaking with the axis of losers. Absolutely staggering. It's like the conceitedness of Hadley to repeatedly talk about North Korea, Russia, and Iran as the axis of losers. So what conflict have they actually lost? The North Koreans haven't been defeated by the entire global organization that went against them in the Korean War. Nor have they been forced to back down in relation to their nuclear weapons programs. We've got Iran. They are certainly undefeated at this point, despite 45 years of sanctions on them. And has Russia been defeated? The whole of NATO have thrown in hundreds of billions of dollars, arguably a lot of defense forces, and still Russia is now making steady progress all along the line of contact. So none of that is true in any regard whatsoever. So here now, 2 hours and 40 minutes into this process, I think I'll try and play the final song, if indeed we are still live, which we seem to be. Thank you to the 30 or so hardy fans of Weaponized News who have endured through all the technical problems we've been having. Do hope that Sam will be able to piece this together, as he suggested he will be able to. Now, the final song, if this is even the one that plays after the other song, and just to go over the titles again, we had the Wondrous Future. That I will definitely play again. That's absolutely extraordinary. The Cosmonaut song. Then the other one was On Mars, There Will Be Apple Blossoms. I'm sure Elon Musk would love to see that. And this final one is Glory Goes to Those Who Look Forward. And I would suggest that that is definitely the case here. So with kind thanks to all of our hardy listeners who have persevered, and with a request once again, very briefly, for sharing this and possibly sending us a financial contribution, let's close out with this final futuristic Soviet song.
Заправлены в планшеты космические карты, и штурман уточняет последний раз маршрут. Давайте-ка, ребята, споемте перед стартом, у нас еще в запасе 14 минут. Я верю, друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. Когда-нибудь с годами припомним мы с друзьями, как по дорогам звездным вели мы первый путь. как первыми сумели достичь заветной цели и на родную землю со стороны взглянуть. Я верю, друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. Давно нас ожидают далекие планеты, холодные планеты, безмолвные поля. Но ни одна планета не желтоса, как эта планета дорогая, по имени Земля. Я верю, друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. Друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы.